Thank you so much, Christoph. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity. I am very sorry of not being able of attending yesterday session because of I was flying from Dubai to Buenos Aires in a very long trip. So I will have the pleasure of addressing, as you have said, some of the very practical problems that we are facing in Latin America and the Caribbean on the topic of disability. Because of this, I named my presentation Care Economy and Disability, a community-based approach to public policies from the peripheries. Let me start by saying that 14.7% of the population of LAC, about 85 million people, which is equivalent to the entire population of Colombia and Peru combined, has some form of disability. But beyond these global statistics, it is interesting to know that households where people with disability live are poorer. In 1 out of every 5 extremely poor households lives a person with a disability. 15% of children with disability do not go to school, and 1 out of every 2 heads of households with disability do not participate in the labor market. Illiteracy is 5 times higher among people with disabilities. So the situation of simultaneous poverty and disability also particularly affects women. 6 out of 10 female heads of households with disabled members are unemployed. So I would like to mention 3 main transitions that we need to consider in order to deepen the knowledge and the practical responses in this very important topic. The first transition is from the bureaucratic approach to the communitarian approach. On the one hand, the innovation of social practices includes attending to the realities of community care, which involves a wide range of supports that seeks to protect subjects, families, and the social context in which disability develops. This social innovation is very important, taking into account the emergence of popular movements throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. The second transition has to do with, I call the calligraphic revolution to practical support. As calligraphic revolution, I named the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability that has been ratified by many countries in the region, but sadly is not put in practice and is not facing a concrete form of achieve his very important principles. So I guess that we need a new welfare state, a new concept of welfare state, overcoming a mere monetary or institutionalist approach to disability and promoting inclusive and effective social policies. And the third transition has to do with the multi-dimensional barriers to physical and digital autonomy. So the technological aspect of disability is very important, and I will mention some very specific examples on this regard. So let me explore more deeply the first innovation. In the image of the Good Samaritan, the Gospels tell us, he saw him and was moved. While the doctors of the law passed by, the recording of the pain of the neighbor and its practical consequence were a continuum of mercy that is also important to highlight in these times in the problematica that concerns us. The conceptual definition is not merely a semantic or grammatical issue, but has an impact on the public policies to be implemented. The above leads us to the next point, which is crucial for the deployment of humanized public policies. Let me stress this concept. Without accurate statistics and adequate records that account for this reality, the effectiveness of public policies diminishes and social awareness itself fails to overcome discriminatory or biased views. It is not only the way of looking at the problem that counts, but also the way of asking and recording the problem. First, it's interesting to know that instead of using the terms disability, a more neutral language is used in the census and surveys, focus on the difficulties and limitation to perform basic tasks. In Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Mexico, Panama, Uruguay, and so on, this has been a very important change in the national census and national surveys. It is also key to deepen initiatives that must do mainly with the measurement of the care economy phenomenon, measuring its contribution to the gross domestic product and with satellite national accounts, as Colombia is doing. And it's also important not losing sight of the contribution of women in activity related to the care of persons with disability. Third, in the case of minors and education, UNICEF developed specific modules which have an additional difficulty of implementation because in many cases they are answered by parents or guardians. There is another statistical gap with respect to the usual precariousness of children with disability who are institutionalized, which is not recorded by household surveys and therefore ignores the vulnerability in which they live. Within small spaces, lack of personalized attention, poorly paid staff, and the absence of a family support group for more comprehensive support. There is very important aspect that has to do with the invisible statistics, especially for people with psychosocial or intellectual disabilities. Is another enormous challenge for the political policies, for the political approach. In terms of evaluating the impact of programs, the situations described above generate a very worrying fog of scientific evidence. There are very few studies that analyze the impacts of social protection schemes for people with disability, not merely within Latin America and the Caribbean, but also with respect to the more developed countries. Finally, as has been said in this seminar, it is of primary importance to listen to the voice of the community organizations and the beneficiaries of the programs to promote a bottom-up approach that overcomes paternalistic bureaucracies, actions that do not meet real needs and technocratic positions. Lord, let him see is not only the appeal of the blind man in the gospel, but the request that is needed today to make the phenomenon visible and to take due note from all sectors. The second innovation, I named this second innovation the universal paradigm sensitive to differences. Universal paradigm sensitive to difference. Thinking from the peripheries and building responses from below, paraphrasing the Pope's request in Laudato Deum to renew multilateralism. So that means abandoning unilateral approaches. Neither the state alone can solve all problems, nor can mercantilisms or the organized community provide answers if they are left to the law of the jungle of every man for himself. The new welfare state that embraces the effective human rights of people with disabilities implies a construction that involves political sensitivity, fiscal prioritization in budgets, and continuity in progress. It does not exhaust the set of intervention, but is an indispensable social network in Latin America. Let me refer very briefly to the case of Argentina. People with accredited disabilities through an evaluation board and access to the single disability certificate are entitled to, among other benefits, to. I will refer some of these benefits. 100% coverage in basic health benefits, non-contributory pension, family allowance for disabled child for formal workers and in vulnerable situations, maternity allowance to the birth of a child with Down syndrome, the right to study in regular schools and to receive the necessary support to learn and participate, 4% quota of state employment for people with disability and tax benefits for the private sector to hire people with disability. This is the theoretical framework, but that contrasts with the reality of the lack of labor inclusion. In Argentina, more than 87% of people over 14 years with a single certificate of disability do not have a job. Only 3 out of 10 companies currently include people with some type of disability in their work areas, and more than 60% of these organizations lack programs and policies that promote the incorporation of people with disability. So, in one hand, we have the calligraphic revolution of legal framework and the international convention, and on the other hand, we have the lack of results in the application of this theoretical approach. So the invisible hand of the state are compensated by the visible hand of popular neighbors and popular movements. Argentina has a bonus of solidarity and community fabric that is expressed in a significant fact. Only 8% of families with young children are headed by mothers raising children without the support of other cohabitant adults. So there is a familiar network and a familiar fabric and a community fabric that compensate the lack of state presence in the poorest neighborhoods. The symphonies of care are multiple. The attacks fall mainly on women. They affect more intensely the poorest segment of the population. They tend to distinguish strongly between the stage of childhood, which usually falls on the family group with clear gender tendencies, and the stage of old age, whose care tends to be commercialized, thus impacting more directly on the family economy. That is a very important distinction. In the childhood, the familiar groups are taking care of people with disability, but in the old age, there is a commercial activity with a paying or paid social carers. This national reality also extends in many other LAC countries. In countries as different as Brazil, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, and Uruguay, people with disability are on average 44% less likely to complete primary education, but 30% less likely if they also belong to an ethno-racial minority. The imbalances are also multiplied by gender bias inequalities, and also the value of unpaid care work range between 16% and 25% of the GDP. Let me mention some important social policies that should be reinforced to overcome this situation. First, it is essential that the pension granted are compatible with the work activity of the beneficiaries. The informality rate of people with disability is 11% higher than with people without disability. It is important to promote training for self-employment. It is important that the disability certificates should be easy to obtain. Cash transfers should be part of more comprehensive assistance. The need to consider the framework of decent work and rights of caregivers and care for persons is also central as part of the pending agenda. Psychosocial disability is the new old name of vulnerability, with serious mortgages for the future. The consumption of illicit drug and alcohol is mainly causing schizophrenia, bipolarity, and depression in adolescent population, illnesses that consequently lead to psychosocial disability. The situation is very serious in LAC. Already the World Health Organization foresees that this will be the third cause of disability in the world, among other factors. The promotion of creative modes of community participation and care that promote personalization and family containment is also of high impact. In Uruguay, for example, the community care homes are an early childhood care service provided by an authorized caregiver who works in his or her home and in the community physical space. Not the least of this is the cluster of actions of a cultural nature that must be promoted in order to remove the stereotypes and bias disseminated by the media about this universe. Lastly, the third innovation. We need to take an exponential leap in equity to take advantage of digital and scientific advances. The World Health Organization Global Report on Assistive Technologies identifies critical points to consider, among others. Establishment of adequate standards in the manufacturing processes of the products, innovation ecosystems to promote startups that can generate exponential advances, reduction of cost and inclusion of the technology as part of universal health benefits, promotion of industrial policies that favor their production, training of health personnel and families to their use, and the development and implementation of new technologies in the health sectors. Telework implies the possibility of overcoming physical accessibility barriers. Equipment that improves hearing, vision, and mobility capacity represent an advance in terms of autonomy and independence, which also requires equal access. A regulatory effort and establishment of standards with the manufacturers of new technologies is required. According to the World Intellectual Property Organization, assistive technology will tend to reach 2 billion people by 2030, including robotization, smart power applications, brain-computer interfaces, smart glasses, home assistance robots, neuroprosthetics, 3D manufacturing, and exoskeleton suits, etc. The use of artificial intelligence and its regulation is also of prime importance. In the provision of the European Union Act, for example, people with disability, minors, and the elderly are at risk and in need of special regulatory attention. The issues of physical barriers associated with the new urban conception are also essential to continue to deepen with technological advances. By way of conclusion, I have mentioned the new welfare state, the need of statistics, and the need of taking into account the technological and digital advances. But we have to overcome the double social madness with a mystique of proximity. Let me mention very briefly what I'm talking about. Giorgio Lapira, the mayor of Florence in the post-World War II period, once said that unemployment is a form of social madness. adapting this quote to the reality we are discussing today, in the case of people with disability, the main challenge is to overcome this double form of social madness, promoting their inclusion, autonomy, and equal opportunities and possibilities. It's not a matter of thinking of isolated initiative, but of endowing them with an associative and cooperative dimension that mobilize soul, head, and heart, as Pope Francis asked us to do. And finally, Madeleine Delbrel, the French social activist, poet, musician, example of dedication to the humblest from the simplicity of everyday life, spoke to us around the same time of La Pira of it. She spoke about the mystique of proximity. It's not a technocratic paradigm or an endless theoretical discussion that we need, but above all is a revolution of tenderness that frees our deepest attention from the daily kidnapping by the noise of social networks, the culture of polarization, and the globalization of indifference. There's a need that for embraces the prevailing culture of encounter, because no one is set alone, as Pope Francis every day remembers us. Thank you very much.